Welcome to Local Everywhere. My guest today is Diane Sare, and Diane and I are political buddies. But Diane is also a trained musician, and she's going to talk about music and how that can have a healing effect on this world. So, Diane, tell us a little bit about your musical background and what you think it could mean to the general public at large.
Okay, well, I appreciate this. And the timing of this interview is excellent because I just was on a Kingston radio program where you choose a number of soundtracks or whatever links of music that affected you. So it caused me to really reflect on how music ended up having such a big role in my life. I did attend New England Conservatory of Music, finally, for music education, trombone performance, composition. Did not get a degree, and in music, that doesn't matter so much if you can perform really well, but I chose another path, which was politics. So, but it's come in very handy. And I realized the first song I remember learning was a Japanese children's song because my father was in Vietnam and he got these records, which he mailed back to us, and I started playing it nonstop. And that was the first thing I really remember singing, and I still have that in my head to this day. Then it was the Quaker meeting, and the old time Quakers are supposed to be very austere, like poor Benjamin West, the artist who had to make paintbrushes out of his cat's fur because Quakers weren't supposed to have music or painting or anything beautiful, and everything was supposed to be gray and boring and dark and nothing that would give pleasure to the senses, I think. But at any rate, happily, that's changed. So the meeting I was in we learned all these Quaker songs, which also many of them were anti-war songs. Since my father was in Vietnam and we lived briefly on a military base, my mother would take me with her to visit widows, people who had lost their husbands in the war. I remember being very affected by this, not understanding what war was, but wanting it to end. And then my mother was quite musical. She played the piano and clarinet. She was a biochemist, but she would sing to us every night. So I grew up always singing. I'm not a terribly great singer now. I didn't put a lot of work into it, but I can carry a tune. And I took some singing lessons because I founded a chorus, and I figured if I'm going to be directing a chorus, I better at least understand something about singing and voice placement and how to get the sound that you want from a chorus. So I did some work on that. But music was always a huge part of my life. We sang in the car, we sang rounds, we went out Christmas caroling. We one winter growing up in Maine, we had a very good, my sister's best friend was in another family, which also was very musical. And the father, they went on a trip to Germany, and he came back with lederhosen and all these Bavarian costumes and little papa songs. Mm-hmm. And we went out on the front porch. It must have been 15 degrees outside. And, my mother played the clarinet, my father played the trumpet, he played the tuba, I played euphonium and that. And we would sit out on the porch and just play and play. I don't know what the neighbors thought of it. So that, and I really think this should be part of everyone's background. Have you seen, there's a Norman Rockwell painting of a barber shop. I think it's a barber shop. Mm-hmm. And you can see into the back room that after hours, they're all getting together playing string quartets.
No, I don't remember that picture.
Yeah, it just was. And then I found some old ads for the Curtiss Wright factory, ads for the airplanes we were producing for the war. and they show the family at home and the mother's playing the piano and the family's gathered around singing. I mean, that used to really be part of our culture. And I think it's very important now. I was reflecting, I don't know if you're aware, we've crossed a new threshold in mass shootings and mass violence.
Mhm.
They call a mass shooting one in which at least 4 people are shot or killed, but 4 people are hit. Um, we were at one every 16 hours. In
What?
yeah, every 16 hours in the United States is a mass shooting, but last week we had one every 8 hours.
Wow. I'm just finishing up a book about the tower shooting in Texas in '66, Charles Whitman,
Mm,
where he had armed himself and he just shot and shot, and that was like the first mass murder there was in this country, and it's escalated since then.
yes. And you saw the thing with the car driving into a crowd of people at a bus stop, killing 8 people. So I think the hyper discussion about guns is a diversion if you don't look at the culture. If you're going to have people plowing cars into people, are we going to ban automobiles? We have to change the culture. And I think this is why music is so important, because it's universal.
Hmm.
It's go ahead.
So, you've done a lot of singing and you've been in choruses and stuff, and you think it's important, but, as our society becomes more violent, do you believe that music becomes more important?
Urgent. I think part of the reason for the violence is there's no outlet in the public schools for children who have emotions that they're trying to express. I mean, children today are growing up in a terrifying world, from the COVID lockdowns to the mass shootings to the ugly sexualized culture. That's a very heavy load for a 6-year-old. And they probably are being subject to emotions that they don't understand, that they don't know how to express, so they can lash out or lash inward. I think suicides among children have tripled in the last years. So if you give them art, they don't have art, they don't have drama, and they certainly don't have classical music. Schools are not teaching children to play instruments. They're not singing in a chorus. They're really alienating people from their own creativity and their own getting to know their own mind, because that's what happens when you're working on singing or producing something beautiful. It's not really for an audience. It is, in a sense, to convey an idea, but it's also really a dialogue with your own mind.
I've seen some of your concerts on YouTube, and you do a great job. And tell us a little bit about the music that you have done.
Well, okay, so in 2014, I we had this, not just the death of Eric Garner in a police chokehold of strangulation, seen on video by millions of people, but then the Staten Island grand jury came back saying there was no basis to indict any officer in that clearly horrific action, unwarranted strangulation for someone who was selling cigarettes or something. And I knew that there would be an enormous amount of rage, and you had riots in St. Louis at the time. So I said, well, what can we do to lift this above the kind of divisions that are going to be stoked and the rage among groups of people, whether it's Black versus white, civilians versus police, whatever you want to call it. So I said, we're going to do a sing along of Handel's Messiah. which is dedicated to the sanctity of every human life, whatever your background. Revenge is not justice. Justice is a different principle. So we pulled this together on 6 days' notice. I was trying to get an orchestra. I was hanging out at conservatories, the Manhattan School of Music and Juilliard, looking to see who was carrying a violin on their back and running after them and asking if they would come and play in this little orchestra. And I got some referrals from Gregory Hopkins at Abyssinian Baptist Church in Manhattan. He's a marvelous musician who I'd known for years. He put me in touch with a magnificent organist and pianist named Bob Wilson, who, when I reached out to him, he said, "Oh, the Schiller Institute? Of course I'm familiar with the Schiller Institute." And I said, "How is that?" He said, "Well, I was the accompanist for Carlo Bergonzi." For people who don't know, Carlo Bergonzi was one of the magnificent operatic tenors ever. And what Bob Wilson recounted is that people from the Schiller Institute had come into a rehearsal at the, I think, Casa di Verdi in Milan, because one of the things my chorus does is we sing at the Verdi tuning. We don't sing at A440. We sing at about 430, 431. Verdi mandated that A could be no higher than 432 because you would ruin the singing voices and they'd have to bellow to sing over the orchestra if you tighten up all those strings and make the sound so bright. So this pianist, organist knew of us from then. Thank God he came because he knew all the parts, and we had a one double bass player who really had no clue where he was. I mean, I guess that's what happens when you pick people up off the street. He would be literally playing the wrong piece. He wasn't even in, he was playing the Hallelujah chorus when other people were singing Comfort Ye, if you can imagine.
Mhm.
And so Bob was playing his part on the piano or the harpsichord, and then yelling to the bass player his part, C sharp, A, it was amazing. But the soloists were incredible. In fact, the mezzo soprano Rehan Bryce Davis, who joined us for that, she was now taken in by Krista Ludwig and has a magnificent career singing in Aida all over the world. So we had these wonderful soloists, this little pickup orchestra, a chorus of people who wanted to sing, 6 days notice, and 100 people showed up. I
Wow.
couldn't believe it.
Wow.
Yeah. And then afterwards, someone said to me, "Why don't you start a community chorus in New York City? Why should this just be a one-time thing?" So we started the Schiller Institute NYC chorus, and we had a policy: no auditions. We will not audition anyone. We had sectionals. We give people an opportunity to work. Occasionally we'll tell someone, "Would you please drop out for these 5 measures because you don't really have it and it's very soft right here," or whatever. But we want everyone to have the opportunity to participate. And it creates this delightful environment. Everyone who's come to the rehearsals says it's the most diverse chorus they've ever seen. Prior to COVID, we had chapters of the chorus in Flushing, Queens, which were all Chinese, in Brooklyn, Manhattan, and Bergen County in New Jersey. And when we'd come together for a chorus, and then a group from the Schiller Institute in Virginia and Boston, when we come together for a performance, we would have 160 voices.
Oh, that's nice.
Yeah, it was great. Now we're about 60 or so. We'll have to see. We're picking it back up post-COVID. But I love the chorus, and people seem to love it. It's almost like a sanctuary. You come in, no one cares anything about your background, your past, you're contributing to this process. And it sounds wonderful. I'm always blown away because if you know how people sound by themselves and then you hear the chorus, you wouldn't even think it's possible. The whole is infinitely greater than the sum of the parts.
You have a musical background, and there's people who are painters and writers And I think if I could identify these people and ask them why they do what they do, it would give a whole new perspective on what's going on in society. Would you agree?
Sure. And I think, I mean, why should some people be painters and not everybody, right? Why should some people be musicians and not everybody? I think everybody should be doing these things. It's just part of being human, really.
Yes, but I think people have innate talents.
Mhm.
Like I couldn't take this snapshot and do a portrait of you. It would be horrible. I can't carry a note. So, I'm not, that artistically inclined, but there are people who are making a difference, you know?
Yes, but again, I mean, look, take Albert Einstein. He played the violin.
Okay.
He didn't do it professionally, but he was quite good. But if he got stuck on a scientific problem, he'd go in his room and he'd play the violin for a while and would help kind of free up his mind. And he'd come back with a fresh idea. Max Planck, a brilliant scientist, was nearly a concert pianist. We might have lost him to his music. And you see this really throughout history, that it's part of the development of the mind. That's why I think it's so urgent that children get involved in the arts at a very early age,
Hmm.
before they're afraid, before they're told, oh no, don't do it that way. You have to have room to play. You have to have room to experiment and to discover what you think is pleasant. And I don't mean arbitrary. I actually don't subscribe to the belief that beauty is in the eye of the beholder. And I don't think we have a right to inflict ugliness on people. I would say I agree very much with Friedrich Schiller that the artist is very responsible for the cultural level of the society in which they live. So I think the artists have to take that as a kind of a sacred trust that our job, musician, painter, sculptor, writer, actor, is to ennoble people so that they can become better.
So, since you have a musical background and you kind of answered the question, but how can music change the world?
Well, one way is if people sing in a chorus or play in an orchestra. That's very direct in a sense because everybody's not singing in unison. You have male voices and female voices. They sound very different. Tenor voices sound very different from bass voices. But what you find in a great classical composition is that you can have all these different voices doing something in an orderly way, which creates a kind of harmonic and polyphonic development. And
Mhm.
that way you can see that there's a value in the diversity of your society, that you don't want everyone to sound like a piccolo, that someone has to sound like a tuba, or someone has to be the percussion. Um, and so you develop an appreciation for the fact that other people's talents may not be the same as yours, but that they bring something to the table that wouldn't be there if it were just you and your own personal beliefs or your own personal axioms.
So, if anybody listening or watching this who has an artistic talent that they'd like to share with me on Local Everywhere, please contact me at localeverywhere@aol.com. And you've been listening to Diane Sare. I'm Cynthia Pooler, and this is Local Everywhere. And please subscribe to my YouTube channel. Diane, it's always a pleasure to talk to you. And thank you, everybody, for listening. Have a great day.
Thank you.